On UpFront today, we'll speak with the award-winning Bangladeshi photojournalist and activist Shahidul Alam on his recent imprisonment and the political climate under Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. But first, it's the biggest crisis of our time, climate change. But how do we tackle it, or is it too late? Climate change is ravaging our planet. Last year, thousands of deaths were linked to heat waves and wildfires, while millions of people were impacted by floods and typhoons. Scientists say time is running out to save civilization as we know it. So, what will it take for politicians and the public to tackle what is perhaps the greatest crisis of our time? And does confronting climate change require confronting our economic system, taking on capitalism? Or is it all too little, too late? Joining me to discuss all this and more, a panel of experts. From New York, James Hansen, the world-renowned climate scientist and former director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. From LA, VARSHINI PRAKASH, climate activist and co-founder of the Sunrise Movement that's grabbed headlines by occupying US congressional offices. And here in the studio, Amanda Mukwashi, CEO of the global NGO Christian Aid. Thank you all for joining me on UpFront. James, let me start with you. You've been dealing with the science behind all of this stuff for decades. How long do we have to tackle climate change before it becomes too late? We hear a lot these days about there being just 12 years to turn things around.
Well, there's no such arbitrary number. We've reached the timeline. We should be phasing down emissions now. And if we do that, we will get a little bit warmer than we are now, and then temperature can begin to decline. But that requires that we phase out fossil fuels on the time scale of the next several decades. And we're not taking the actions to do that.
Varshini, you and your generation of millennials say that you see the challenge of climate change as your World War II. Do you actually believe that, or is that just a way of trying to get people to take it more seriously? And if you do believe that, how do you win this new World War?
I mean, people are dying right now, and that's what we have to grapple with, that the climate crisis is already upon us. There are 3,000 Americans that have perished in the last year because of Hurricane Maria. We have seen wildfires absolutely raze entire cities to the ground in a matter of minutes. Parts of our coastline are losing more than a football field of land a minute. So the climate crisis is upon us, and that is just with 1 degree of warming that we have seen so far. And scientists are telling us that if we don't stop it at 1.5 or 2 degrees, we are going to reach a tipping point, a point of no return. So right now we're saying to ourselves as young people, like, what is the world that we are going to have to live in a few decades if we don't do something right now?
Amanda, you're the CEO of a global development NGO. A lot of this conversation happening here in the West is about the West. What impact is climate change having already on the ground across the rest of the world, especially in the developing world, in places like sub-Saharan Africa? What does climate change look like to the poor who are having to live through it?
Thanks. Well, let me paint a picture for you. And I think you're right to say that the conversations are happening here in the West. But actually, the impact of climate change is already being felt by communities in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of Asia. I was in Ethiopia recently. I was in South Omo, which is on the border with South Sudan, in a place called Jinka. One of the women there said to me, Amanda, it's getting hotter and hotter. And the hot seasons are getting closer and closer to each other. Our crops are failing, our livestock is dying, and we need to find other ways of survival in terms of income sources. That's the real lived experience and impact of climate change. And you know where the tragedy is? The tragedy is that these communities are the ones that have contributed the least to climate change as we know it. They haven't benefited at all from the use and abuse and exploitation of fossil fuels.
Okay. James Hansen, you were there in front of Congress in 1988, you know, kind of sounding the alarm bell, calling for action, pointing out what the science was saying. Did you think that, you know, all these decades later, we'd still be having these conversations? And do you recognize that the reason we're having these conversations is a lot to do with the economic impact that fighting climate change would require, the economic change that it would require, and the resistance to that change?
Well, you know, the problem is caused by carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels. So what we have to do is raise the price of these fossil fuels. But we have to do it in a way that the public is able to deal with the increasing price of fossil fuels and make the changes needed to move to other sources of energy. And then the economy can work for us. But so far, the fossil fuel industry has been able to lobby the governments and keep us hooked. That's what has to change.
Varshini, in terms of what has to be done, you're a prominent advocate of what's been called the Green New Deal, this ultra-ambitious 10-year mobilization plan to get the US to zero net emissions, zero net greenhouse gas emissions, and also create millions of new green jobs in the process. A lot of people say that's just not realistic. You're not going to get the American public on board for that.
I don't think that that's true. And I think what the Green New Deal is about is actually exactly all the things that you mentioned, of getting off of fossil fuels, of stopping the climate crisis, but tying that to the creation of tens of millions of good, high-paying jobs, of actually boosting and revitalizing our economy in this process of stopping climate change as well and eliminating poverty.
Let me bring in James. Let me bring in Amanda, then James. I want to get Amanda and James's response. Green New Deal, yay or nay? Amanda.
I think we definitely need some kind of Marshall Plan for fighting the climate crisis. It is an emergency, and where I like this conversation is that science is giving us new information about the fact that the economic model that we are on is the wrong model, because it is fossil fuel driven. And so for me, I don't think that it's just a question of tinkering with the current economic model. We actually have to look at alternatives. And I don't believe that we don't have the know-how and the knowledge.
Are you saying we can't tackle climate change unless we tackle capitalism?
That's what I'm saying. The whole process of economic development and how the West developed was an economic foundation that is actually hardwired to serve a few at the exploitation and the expense of the planet and people. And unfortunately, the technology and some of the knowledge is sitting in the West, right? And it's about power and it's about wealth. And unless we see such a time when the West itself is being heavily impacted on by climate change, I think that we are still going to see a slow movement of the shift.
The Green New Deal, as they've defined it, is nonsense. We need a real deal which understands how economics works and what we need to do in order to move off of fossil fuels. And that requires, in addition to this rising carbon fee with the distribution to the public, we also have to have the technologies. We have to help the developing countries. The Western world burned the carbon budget for the whole world. Yes. Now we've got a problem, and we're going to have to help those countries that want to raise their standards of living to match ours. And so it's a big problem, but it's a solvable problem.
Varshini, you and James Hansen both agree on the scale of the challenge, but he thinks your solution is nonsense.
Yeah. Well, I would say that I don't think that simply putting a price on carbon is going to be enough in this moment. I think if it were 30 years ago, that might have been enough. And even after the most recent IPCC report, the UN climate report that came out last fall said that we need to make unprecedented changes to every part of our economy and our society to stop this crisis. So I don't think that that's going to be enough. I think we need to overhaul our economy. We need, we need to consider.
James and Amanda.
Yeah, it's not enough, but it's the underlying policy that's required to make the price of fossil fuels honest. Otherwise, people will keep burning them the same way that we did in the West. Because people need energy. If they're going to raise their standard of living, they need energy. And we need to make the price of fossil fuels include their cost to society. That's the underlying requirement. But there is technology development also.
Can I just quickly touch on, because James talked about matching, that the developing world wants to match the development of the West. There are just under 1 billion people without electricity, without access to electricity in the world. And this is not something that is going to happen overnight just by tackling bit by bit divesting from fossil fuels. I think we have to do more than just divest a little bit. I think we have to stop. We actually have to stop, because the emergency is people are dying on a daily basis. I can't overemphasize that enough.
Let me ask you this question. In your travels, especially in places like Africa, do you see an alliance of governments or leaders that can work to tackle this problem, even if the White House is currently filled with a person who doesn't want to take this seriously, who's pulling the US out of Paris, who thinks it's all a Chinese hoax? Even with that roadblock that is the US president, are there enough governments with the willpower, Varshini mentioned political will, to actually take this seriously and get action done, even if they have to go around the United States?
Well, leaders come and go. Climate change is not going to come and go unless we do something about it. I think that if you look, for example, at the African Development Bank, what they have done is they've got a strategy and they've raised their ambition in terms of targets of looking at clean energy, sustainable clean energy, and looking at off-grid, mini grids to reach the communities in Africa. So in terms of an alliance, I think there are enough people, there's enough momentum that we're having. But can I just say that we need a bigger groundswell of communities, of the private sector.
So, James, you've been campaigning on this issue for a long time. People now take it more seriously. When you look at the current president of the United States, how much damage is he doing to your cause, to your argument, to spreading the scientific facts and figures? What role is he playing in undermining all of this?
Well, he's made it easier for us to file our lawsuits. We have lawsuits against Trump and beginning to have them against the fossil fuel industry. And he's just made it much clearer. So I think the case in court is now ironclad. So I expect to see some wins in the very near future.
And Varshini, let me end with you. Last word. You're 25 years old, I believe. This is only going to get more serious over the course of your lifetime. How does your generation in particular avoid paralysis on this, avoid the prospect of it's all doom and gloom, we're finished, there's nothing we can do, we might as well just give up?
Yeah, well, I would say the only antidote to grief and despair is action. And bringing young people into the political process to make our voices heard and to ensure that this political class, the establishment right now, does not leave our generation to bear the brunt of impending disaster. Throughout our history, the greatest transformational societal change that has occurred has been because tons of young people stood up and said enough is enough.
Varshini, James, Amanda, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you all for joining me on UpFront. The US military says it's doing a fantastic job fighting violent groups across Africa. But over 10 years after US Africa Command first began operations, is that really the case? UpFront producer Kieran Alvey has this week's reality check.
We hear a lot about the U.S. in the Middle East, but do you know where it has an imperial-scale military presence, fighting on forever war fronts and anti-terror operations most of us know nothing about? Africa.
I didn't know there was 1,000 troops in Niger.
U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM, has received billions of dollars over the past decade to train foreign militaries in counterterrorism tactics and coordinate joint operations. It's propped up around 50 mostly unofficial bases from Morocco to Mozambique and has been fighting in at least 13 countries, including what some call Africa's Afghanistan, Somalia. The head of AFRICOM insists
special operators are doing a fantastic job across the continent.
But are they really? As U.S. military presence has dramatically increased in Africa, so have terror-related attacks, going from 41 to nearly 2,500 in 2017, with reports saying U.S. strategy has only strengthened the hand of radical groups. And the violence extends even beyond terrorists. In the fight against Boko Haram, U.S.-trained and backed Nigerian forces have starved, suffocated, tortured, or extrajudicially executed 8,000 people. In fact, over a dozen U.S.-trained militaries have been accused of human rights abuses, from operating secret torture prisons to shooting at women and children. And the U.S. once admitted they failed to train in values and ethics. Is it any wonder the majority of African countries resisted AFRICOM's creation? Partly why its headquarters were put in Europe. Even recently, thousands of Ghanaians protested the U.S. military, saying it's become a curse everywhere they are. Mauritania ended a U.S. military program because they were, quote, never comfortable with what they signed up for. And tribal leaders in Niger said U.S. bases are a magnet for the terrorists. Even an AFRICOM-sponsored study said the U.S. has largely failed to achieve its goals. In response, the Pentagon said they would scale back some operations, just not ones like the largest Air Force construction project of all time. As a former AFRICOM official put it, once you start these things, it's hard to turn off.
For more than 3 decades, award-winning photographer Shahidul Alam has been documenting government abuse and humanitarian crises around the world. Last year, he was arrested while covering protests in his home country of Bangladesh, and now faces up to 14 years in prison on charges of spreading propaganda and false information against the government. His arrest provoked a worldwide demand for his release and earned him a place among Time magazine's People of the Year. Shahidul Alam's case is a test for democracy in a country many say is sliding towards authoritarianism. He joins me now. Shahidul Alam, thanks for joining me on UpFront.
Good to be here.
Last August, you were covering the student protests in Dhaka, which started over a lack of road safety, I believe. And then you gave an interview to this channel, Al Jazeera English. What happened next?
I was sitting at my desk, uploading pictures. The doorbell rang. I went to open the door. I was alone in the house, and then people came round the back. They'd obviously been lurking on the side and grabbed me. I know what happens in Bangladesh.
Police officers, or?
They were in plain clothes, so
Okay.
they didn't introduce themselves. But I could work out what was going on. And really at that point, my interest was in making sure that someone knew that this was happening to me. So I resisted, I screamed. Eventually, I got taken in to a van waiting downstairs, handcuffed, blindfolded, and taken away. I didn't know where I was taken to, but once I got there, I was interrogated, tortured, and the following day...
You say they tortured you?
Yes.
They beat you?
I was hit, I was bleeding, I was blindfolded, so I couldn't see what was actually being done. And blood was dripping down from my face, from my nose and mouth, onto my clothes. And I was also, they threatened me with waterboarding. They told me it would get a lot worse. They talked about pins. They threatened that it would get a lot worse, and that my partner would also get
Earlier this year, on Head to Head, I interviewed Gauhar Rizvi, a close advisor to the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina. He not only claimed to be completely unaware of any harm that you suffered in detention, he also said you were jailed for, quote, spreading disinformation, which was inciting violence. He accused you of spreading false stories of rape, which led to riots. What do you say to him?
I was documenting things as they were happening. Now, I don't own a time machine, so incitement is something that happens after an event. I was recording the event, and there's clear documentation of the thing having gone on for quite some time before I was recording it. There is nothing absolutely that I said or did which had anything to do with making statements myself. I reported what was going on. That is what a journalist does, any journalist.
So these are fabricated charges,
Completely.
accusations against you. And Gauhar Rizvi, the Prime Minister's advisor who's defended your arrest and detention, he says he's your friend. Is he?
Well, I do know the guy, and we have met in situations. I sort of have a different definition of friends, but also they say our neighboring country, India, is our friend. And I can see what that relationship is between our countries, so I'd be wary of those friends.
And what's your relationship like with the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, who has called you, quote, mentally sick? What is it about you that bothers her so much? Why are you such a threat to her, do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I speak out, I protest, I'm very upfront about what I say. That shouldn't be a threat to any government. But obviously, this is a government that feels threatened by it. I think also, I'm not the only one. Professor Yunus was vilified before. Chief Justice was moved away. I think I was another thorn on the path, and there was an election coming up. I was saying things which were the truth and therefore unpalatable.
The timing was bad for you, I guess. Today you're free on bail, but facing up to 14 years in prison over violations of what human rights groups have called a repressive digital security law, which gives the Bangladeshi police the power to monitor people's online activities and arrest critics without warrants. I believe it's been used more than 1,200 times in recent years. You're currently challenging the legality of that law, I believe, in the High Court. Explain to our viewers what you think is at stake, not only for yourself, but also for other Bangladeshi citizens and journalists if you lose your case.
It's about freedom of expression, and certainly that is the mainstay of any democracy. Whether democracy exists in Bangladesh or not itself is a question, but I think if we lose this case, then it'll be a very, very poor signal for journalists and people at large.
Do you believe Bangladesh is still a democracy, functioning democracy?
Not in the way it operates. Officially,
how would you
it is.
Describe it?
It's an autocracy by any means. It has been for some time. I mean, while it is true that things are particularly bad now, but all the way through. I mean, I left Bangladesh when I was in 1972, a free country. I came back to find a military dictator. There was an election. We tried to bring down the general, but elections didn't lead to a democratic process. And none of the political parties we've had have practiced democracy since then.
See, Sheikh Hasina would say she won a landslide victory in December's elections in Bangladesh. Now, she's been accused of vote rigging. She's been accused of violations of electoral law. But at the same time, it's undeniable that she's hugely popular in Bangladesh. Surely you would concede that point. And she probably would have still won even if she didn't allegedly cheat. Isn't that a problem for people like yourself, that you're a critic of hers, but you're in a minority in your own country?
I don't believe I'm a minority at all. In fact, it is true that she has a following, but since this arrest, I get stopped in the streets, people hug me, they have tears in their eyes, telling me, you said what needed to be said, but no one was speaking out. It's a turbulent place out there, and I think there's a lid on it which keeps it the way it is.
Is that lid related to the economy? Because a lot of her supporters constantly point out that during her 10 consecutive years as Prime Minister, per capita income in Bangladesh has tripled, the economy has grown, life expectancy in Bangladesh is now higher than in India and Pakistan. Would you at least concede that on the economic front, if not on the political front, she has delivered for her people?
I think Bangladesh has done well. That's undeniably true. I think it's done well despite the government, not because of it.
Interesting.
But more importantly, I think the real people who make Bangladesh prosper are our migrant workers, our garment workers, our farmers in the field. On the other hand, you have Bangladesh having the largest growth of rich people in the world today. And over the last 11 years, over $83 billion have been sent out of the country. This wealth benefits a few people. It's generated by some people, it's used and abused by others.
You're perhaps Bangladesh's most acclaimed photojournalist. Your work has been published all over the world. You've trained hundreds of young photographers as well. In the long run, what role do you think your work plays in safeguarding democracy, promoting civil society in a country like Bangladesh, which you say is an autocracy, others say is at best sliding towards autocracy? What role do you think your own work plays?
I think there are two aspects. One is ensuring accountability and transparency, which is required in any system. One of my concerns is that the institutions that should hold any state in place have been gradually eroded and destroyed. Therefore, we work on three areas: media, education, and culture, to exert pressure upon the political space so politicians cannot get away with what they've done so far. To be fair, it's not just this regime. I think pretty much all the regimes we've had in the past have played the same role. It's at a level today which we've never had before.
And you're traveling abroad right now. You're on bail, but you've been allowed to leave the country, visiting the US, visiting Mexico. What is your message when you're out of Bangladesh, not just to your supporters, but to foreign governments, international groups, who look at Bangladesh as a successful economy, look at Sheikh Hasina as an ally in various walks of life? What's your message to them?
I think I need to point out to foreign governments that the role they're playing in being pally with pliant dictators it's hugely problematic. They talk about freedom and democracy. I don't believe they go anywhere beyond working for self-interest. And it's very problematic that they will put up with a pliant dictator when their needs are served. So delivering on the Rohingya, delivering on the war on terror, which is problematic itself. But the fact that...
So you don't place much faith in international efforts to try and check what's happening at home in your country?
I don't believe there's such a thing as morality in international politics.
Last time you came on this channel and did an interview, you were arrested and then beaten. So I'm kind of surprised to see you back on this channel. You're a brave man. Are you worried what's going to happen to you when you return to Bangladesh after this interview?
I'm wary, as one needs to be, but I'm the citizen of an independent state, and my constitution gives me rights. I'm going to exercise those rights, and it's someone else's problem if they have problems with it.
Shahidul Alam, thank you for joining me on UpFront.
Good to be here.
That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.